Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 8, Power Through Non-Engagement. The refusal to enter. At lower levels, every system accepts one assumption: that movement requires engagement. To act is to interact. To advance is to encounter. Every step forward implies entering a field where other forces exist, where resistance may form, where outcomes are shaped through contact. This assumption defines the entire structure of conflict. Because once a system accepts engagement as necessary, it also accepts everything that follows: resistance, reaction, correction, and the continuous need to manage opposition. But this assumption is not absolute. It is a limitation. At higher levels, the system begins to question it, not by resisting resistance, but by refusing to enter the conditions where resistance becomes possible. This is the first shift. The system no longer treats engagement as a requirement. It treats it as a choice. And once it becomes a choice, it can be removed. This does not mean inactivity. The system still moves. It still produces outcomes. It still alters its position within the larger field. But it does so without entering direct interaction with opposing structures. It operates outside the shared layer where conflict forms. This is what defines non-engagement, not avoidance. Separation of operational space. Because resistance requires alignment. Two systems must occupy the same frame, respond to the same signals, and operate within the same thresholds of interaction. Only then can force be applied in a meaningful way. Remove that alignment, and resistance loses function. The system no longer meets opposition. It bypasses it entirely. From the perspective of other systems, nothing has changed. They continue to project influence, apply pressure, and generate force. But those actions require a target that responds within their frame. The system no longer does. It has shifted outside the interaction layer. This creates a new form of movement, one that does not require negotiation, one that does not generate conflict, one that does not activate response. At this level, power is no longer expressed through dominance. It is expressed through refusal. The refusal to engage in structures that produce resistance. And once that refusal becomes structural, not situational, the system gains something more stable than control. It gains independence from opposition itself, operating outside the field. Once the system refuses engagement, a new problem appears. Where does it operate? Because non-engagement is not absence, it is relocation. At lower levels, systems share a common field. They respond to the same signals, react to the same pressures, and move within the same boundaries. This shared field is what allows interaction to exist. It is where resistance forms, where force is applied, and where outcomes are negotiated. But once engagement is removed, the system can no longer remain inside that field. It must shift, not in position alone, in layer. This is the second shift. The system moves into a different operational layer, one that overlaps with the original field, but does not fully align with it. From this position, it can still influence outcomes, but it no longer receives input in the same way. Signals that once triggered response now pass without effect. Pressure that once forced adjustment no longer reaches the system with enough coherence to produce change. The system has not become stronger. It has become less accessible. This is what defines operating outside the field. Not invisibility, selective disconnection. The system still observes. It still maps the environment. It still tracks how other structures move and where pressure accumulates. But it does not respond within the same timing, the same thresholds, or the same pathways. This breaks synchronization, and without synchronization, interaction fails. Because interaction requires shared timing, a force must be applied at a moment when the target is available to receive it. If the system no longer aligns with that moment, the force dissipates. It arrives without effect. At this level, movement becomes asynchronous. The system acts in a way that is not directly readable from within the original field. Its changes do not match expected patterns. Its behavior cannot be predicted using the same logic that governs other systems. This creates a form of asymmetry. One system continues to operate within the shared field, applying pressure based on known rules. The other no longer participates in those rules. This is where advantage emerges, not through speed, not through force, but through separation. Because once a system operates outside the field where resistance is generated, opposition loses its ability to stabilize. It cannot lock onto the system. It cannot track it. It cannot meaningfully interfere with it. And without stable interaction, resistance becomes ineffective. Asymmetry of access. Once the system operates outside the shared field, interaction becomes uneven, not because one system is stronger, because one system is no longer equally accessible. At lower levels, interaction assumes symmetry. If one system can reach another, the reverse is also true. Force travels in both directions. Influence can be applied and returned. This symmetry is what stabilizes conflict. It allows resistance to form because both sides operate within the same conditions. But once non-engagement is established, this symmetry breaks. The system remains capable of observing the field. It can detect movement, track distribution, and identify where pressure is forming. It can still influence outcomes by adjusting its position relative to the field. But the reverse is no longer true. Other systems cannot reach it in the same way. This is asymmetry of access. One side retains visibility, the other loses reach. From within the shared field, this creates confusion. Signals are sent, pressure is applied. Attempts at interaction continue, but they fail to connect. Because connection requires alignment across layers, and that alignment no longer exists. The system is still present, but it is not available. This distinction is critical. Absence would remove influence entirely, but non-engagement preserves influence while removing vulnerability. The system can still shape outcomes. It can still redirect flow. It can still affect distribution across the field. But it does so from a position that cannot be directly engaged. This creates a one-directional relationship. Influence moves outward. Pressure does not return. Over time, this imbalance compounds. Systems that rely on interaction begin to weaken in their ability to respond. They continue to operate based on assumptions of symmetry, expecting that applied force will produce measurable effect. When it does not, they increase intensity. They apply more pressure. They attempt to reinforce interaction through force. But this only amplifies the failure. Because the issue is not insufficient force, it is lack of access. No amount of pressure can reach a system that is no longer aligned with the field where that pressure operates. This is where power shifts completely. Not through dominance, through structural advantage. The system does not need to resist. It does not need to defend. It only needs to maintain its position outside the interaction layer. And as long as that position is stable, opposition becomes irrelevant. Because force without access produces no result. Control without contact. At lower levels, control depends on contact. A system applies force, receives feedback, and adjusts based on response. Every action requires interaction. Every adjustment is informed by resistance. Control is established through continuous exchange between the system and its environment. This model assumes one condition. That influence must pass through direct contact. Without contact, there is no feedback. Without feedback, there is no control. But this assumption only holds inside the shared field. Once a system moves beyond engagement, control changes form. It no longer relies on contact. It relies on positioning. This is the shift. The system does not push against other structures to create change. It alters the conditions under which those structures operate. Instead of applying force directly, it adjusts the environment in ways that indirectly shape outcomes. This is control without contact. Because systems do not act in isolation, They respond to conditions. Every system, no matter how independent it appears, is still influenced by the distribution of energy, the availability of pathways, and the structure of the field it occupies. Change those conditions, and behavior changes automatically. No direct interaction is required. At this level, the system begins to operate through environmental shaping. It identifies key points where small adjustments produce large effects. Points where flow can be redirected, where attention can be shifted, where thresholds can be influenced without direct confrontation. These points are not always obvious. They are not the centers of activity. They are the connectors, the transitions between states, the pathways through which movement occurs. By adjusting these, the system influences outcomes at scale. This is leverage. A minimal input, applied at the correct position, creates disproportionate effect. The system does not need to engage every opposing structure. It only needs to influence the conditions that those structures depend on. Over time, this creates cascading alignment. Systems begin to behave differently, not because they are being forced to, but because the environment no longer supports their previous behavior. Pathways shift. Options change. Certain actions become less effective, while others become more natural. From within the field, this appears organic. There is no visible source of control, no direct application of force, only gradual change. But that change is precise, because it is designed. The system operates at a layer where influence is applied before interaction occurs. By the time other systems respond, they are already reacting to conditions that have been altered. This creates delay, and delay reduces effectiveness, because response is always slower than pre-positioning. At this level, control becomes predictive. The system does not wait for behavior to occur and then adjust. It shapes the conditions that define what behavior is likely to occur in the first place. This removes the need for correction, because outcomes are aligned before they happen. This is the critical advantage. Control without contact eliminates friction. No resistance is triggered. No counterforce is activated. The system influences without being engaged. And because it is not engaged, it is not exposed. This makes the control stable, not dependent on constant interaction, not vulnerable to direct opposition, but embedded in the structure of the field itself. At this point, power is no longer measured by how much force a system can apply. It is measured by how little contact it requires to produce effect. Influence without signal. At lower levels, influence produces signal. A system acts, and that action creates visible change. Movement generates trace. Force produces reaction. Influence becomes measurable because it alters the state of the environment in ways that can be detected, analyzed, and responded to. This is how most systems recognize control, through signal. But signal has a cost. It reveals origin. Every detectable change points back to a source. Every disturbance creates a trail. Every visible effect provides information that can be traced, studied, and countered. The moment influence becomes measurable, it also becomes vulnerable. Because what can be detected can be opposed. This is the limitation of signal-based power. It requires visibility to operate, and visibility invites resistance. But beyond non-engagement, influence changes. It no longer depends on signal. It operates through structure. This is influence without signal. The system does not create visible disturbance to produce effect. It does not generate trace that can be tracked back to its source. Instead, it positions itself in a way that outcomes emerge without requiring identifiable action. This is not absence of influence. It is displacement of visibility. The effect remains. The origin disappears. At this level, the system understands that influence does not always require direct action. Systems are already in motion. They already contain internal dynamics, existing flows, and ongoing processes. Instead of introducing new force, the system works within those existing dynamics. It makes minimal adjustments, small enough to avoid detection, precise enough to change direction. A slight shift in distribution, a minor adjustment in timing, a subtle change in pathway availability. Individually, these do not register as meaningful events. They remain below the threshold of recognition. But collectively, they reshape outcomes. Because systems respond continuously to their conditions. And when conditions change, even slightly, behavior adjusts automatically. At this stage, the system no longer acts in ways that can be isolated. There is no single moment where influence becomes visible. No clear point where cause can be separated from effect. Instead, change appears as continuity, as if it were always part of the system. This is what makes signalless influence stable. It cannot be traced. It cannot be assigned. It cannot be directly opposed. Because opposition requires identification. Without a clear source, resistance has no target. It becomes unfocused, inefficient, delayed. Over time, this creates asymmetry. The system continues to shape outcomes consistently. Other systems continue to respond, but without clarity. They adjust based on visible changes, not on the hidden structure that produced them. This puts them at a disadvantage, because they are always reacting to effects, never to causes. And reaction is always slower. At this level, influence becomes embedded, not in actions, in conditions. The system does not need to apply force repeatedly. It establishes a structure where desired outcomes emerge naturally. Once that structure is in place, influence becomes continuous. No signal required, no detection possible, no direct opposition effective. This is where power becomes quiet, not weak, undetectable. Preemptive alignment. At lower levels, systems respond after change occurs. An event happens. A signal appears. The system detects it, processes it, and adjusts accordingly. This is reactive alignment. The system follows the environment. It waits for conditions to shift, then modifies its behavior to remain stable within those new conditions. This creates a constant delay between cause and response. No matter how efficient the system is, it is always behind the moment of change. This delay is where instability begins, because every reaction is based on something that has already happened. But beyond non-engagement, this sequence breaks. The system no longer waits. It aligns before change becomes visible. This is preemptive alignment. Instead of reacting to signals, the system tracks the underlying structure that produces those signals. It does not focus on events. It focuses on patterns that precede events. Subtle shifts in distribution, gradual accumulation of pressure, small deviations in flow that indicate a change is forming before it fully appears. These are early indicators, not strong enough to trigger reaction, but consistent enough to reveal direction. At this level, the system is not reading the surface. It is reading the formation beneath it. Because every visible change begins as an invisible trend, and trends can be anticipated. This allows the system to move before the environment forces it to. It adjusts its position, distribution, and pathways in advance of visible disruption. By the time change becomes apparent to other systems, it is already aligned with it. From the outside, this appears as perfect timing. The system always seems to be in the right place, always positioned correctly, always unaffected by shifts that destabilize others. But this is not coincidence. It is preparation. Because the system is no longer waiting for confirmation. It acts on probability, not certainty. This is the key difference. Reactive systems require proof. They wait until change is undeniable before adjusting. But by then, the optimal moment has passed. The system has already absorbed unnecessary pressure. It has already entered a phase where correction is required. Preemptive systems do not wait for proof. They act when the direction of change becomes clear enough. This reduces exposure. because the system avoids entering unstable conditions in the first place. It does not need to correct after disruption. It avoids disruption entirely. This creates continuity. Movement remains smooth. No sudden adjustments. No visible reaction. The system appears unaffected by change, when in reality it is already adapted before the change became visible. This is what separates control from prediction. Prediction attempts to guess future states. Preemptive alignment prepares for emerging ones. It does not require accuracy in every detail. It only requires correct direction. And once direction is correct, minor deviations do not destabilize the system. They are absorbed. At this level, time becomes an advantage, not because the system moves faster, but because it moves earlier. This eliminates the gap between event and response, because response happens before the event is fully formed. This removes the need for correction entirely. And without correction, there is no visible struggle, no friction, no resistance. Only continuous alignment. Stability without defense. At lower levels, stability is maintained through defense. A system detects potential disruption, identifies sources of pressure, and prepares mechanisms to resist them. Barriers are reinforced. Thresholds are tightened. Feedback loops are activated to counter any deviation from expected behavior. This creates a defensive structure, one that is constantly monitoring, constantly reacting, constantly maintaining itself against external force. But this type of stability has a cost. It requires continuous energy. It depends on constant awareness, and most importantly, it assumes that disruption will occur. The system is built around the expectation of conflict, because defense only exists where threat is possible. But beyond non-engagement, stability changes form. The system no longer organizes itself around defense. It removes the conditions that make defense necessary. This is stability without defense. Instead of preparing to resist disruption, the system positions itself outside the pathways where disruption forms. It does not strengthen barriers. It removes the need for barriers entirely, because barriers are only required when force is expected. If force cannot reach the system, defense becomes irrelevant. This is not passivity, it is structural positioning. The system analyzes how disruption propagates. It identifies the channels through which pressure travels, the layers where interference becomes effective, and the conditions under which instability forms. Then it shifts, not away from the environment, but away from those channels. This creates separation, not visible distance, operational distance. The system remains within the larger structure, but no longer participates in the same interaction patterns. It does not respond to the same triggers. It does not occupy the same timing. It does not rely on the same pathways. As a result, incoming pressure fails to connect. It dissipates before reaching the system, or it arrives in a form too weak to produce meaningful effect. At this stage, stability is no longer something that must be maintained actively. It becomes inherent, because nothing is directly challenging it. This reduces energy consumption. The system no longer needs to allocate resources toward defense, monitoring, or correction. It does not need to reinforce itself continuously. Its structure remains intact without constant adjustment. This creates endurance, not through resistance, through absence of strain. Because strain accumulates where force is applied. Remove force, and accumulation stops. This also changes how the system responds to unexpected variation. Instead of reacting defensively, it absorbs variation naturally. Small changes do not trigger alarms. Minor disruptions do not escalate into correction cycles. The system remains stable because it is not tightly coupled to reactive mechanisms. This creates flexibility, but not the unstable flexibility of systems under pressure. Controlled flexibility. The ability to adapt without losing coherence. At this level, stability becomes silent. There are no visible signs of defense, no reinforced boundaries, no active countermeasures. From the outside, the system appears unprotected, but in reality, it is unreachable. And unreachable systems do not require protection. This is the final distinction. Defense is a response to vulnerability. Remove vulnerability, and defense disappears. Not because the system is stronger, but because it is no longer exposed. Irreversible positioning. Up to this point, non-engagement has been a strategy, a deliberate choice to operate outside interaction, to avoid alignment with opposing structures, to reduce exposure to resistance. The system moves carefully, positions itself precisely, and maintains separation from the pathways where conflict forms. But at a certain level, this positioning becomes permanent. Not in the sense of being fixed, but in the sense of being irreversible. This is the transition. The system is no longer choosing non-engagement. It is defined by it. Because over time, repeated positioning reshapes the system itself. Its pathways, its internal logic, and its operational structure adapt to the conditions of non-interaction. It no longer maintains the capacity to function effectively within the shared field where resistance exists. It has evolved beyond it. This is irreversible positioning. The system cannot simply return to engagement, because doing so would require abandoning the structural advantages it has developed. It would mean re-entering a layer where interaction is necessary, where resistance becomes active, and where control is dependent on force and feedback. That would be regression. At this level, the system no longer depends on the shared field for its operation. It influences outcomes without entering it. It moves relative to it, but not within it. This creates a form of detachment that is not optional. It is structural. This changes how the system is perceived from the outside. Other systems continue to operate within the shared field. They apply pressure, attempt interaction, and expect response. But the target they are attempting to engage no longer exists within the same operational layer. This creates a gap, not of distance, of compatibility. For interaction to occur, both systems must operate under compatible conditions. Timing must align, signals must be interpretable, pathways must intersect. Without these, force cannot be applied in a meaningful way. Irreversible positioning removes compatibility. The system becomes out of reach, not because it is hidden, but because it no longer shares the conditions required for interaction. This has a compounding effect. Over time, systems that remain within the shared field begin to reorganize around the absence of interaction. They attempt to adjust their behavior, to find new ways to reach the system, to modify their structure in order to re-establish contact. But these attempts are constrained, because they are still operating within the same field. They are trying to solve a problem from inside a structure that no longer contains the solution. This leads to inefficiency. Energy is spent attempting to reach a system that cannot be reached. Pathways are adjusted in ways that produce no effect. Feedback loops respond to absence rather than presence, creating cycles of correction that do not lead to alignment. The system, meanwhile, remains unaffected. It does not need to respond. It does not need to adjust. Its position is stable precisely because it is no longer dependent on interaction. This is where power becomes self-sustaining. Not because the system is actively maintaining control, but because its position prevents disruption from forming. No resistance means no need for correction. No correction means no structural drift. No drift means stability over time. At this stage, the system gains something more valuable than control. It gains permanence of advantage, because its position is not temporary. It is built into its structure. Even if external conditions change, the system does not lose alignment. It does not depend on specific configurations of the environment. It operates at a level where environmental variation has reduced impact. This is the highest form of stability. Not static, independent. Because independence from interaction removes the primary source of instability. At this level, the system no longer needs to avoid resistance. Resistance cannot form. Non-reactive dominance. At lower levels, dominance is expressed through response. A system establishes control by reacting faster, applying greater force, or maintaining stronger resistance. It demonstrates superiority by outperforming opposing structures within the same field of interaction. Every advantage is measured through engagement, but this model contains a limitation. It requires participation. No matter how advanced the system becomes, it remains bound to the dynamics of interaction. It must respond to pressure. It must adjust to external input. It must remain engaged with the forces that attempt to influence it. This creates dependency, because as long as response is required, control is never fully independent. Beyond non-engagement, this dependency disappears. The system no longer defines dominance through response. It defines it through absence of reaction. This is non-reactive dominance. The system does not counter pressure. It does not adjust to external force. It does not respond to attempts at interaction. Instead, it maintains its structure in a way that renders those attempts ineffective from the beginning. This is not passive stability. It is active positioning. Because the system is not ignoring pressure, it is structured so that pressure cannot produce meaningful effect. This distinction is critical. Ignoring pressure would create vulnerability, but removing the pathway through which pressure operates eliminates vulnerability entirely. At this stage, external systems continue to act. They generate signals. They attempt to apply influence. They adjust their strategies in response to the absence of interaction. But none of these actions produce measurable change in the system, because change requires coupling, and coupling no longer exists. This creates a paradox from the outside perspective. The system appears inactive, unresponsive, unaffected. But in reality, it is operating at a level where response is unnecessary. This is what defines true dominance. Not the ability to win in conflict, but the ability to make conflict irrelevant. Because conflict only exists where both sides participate. Remove participation, and conflict collapses. This changes how power is perceived. At lower levels, power is visible. It is expressed through force, reaction, and control over outcomes within a shared field. It generates clear signals that indicate influence is being applied. But at this level, power becomes invisible. There are no visible signs of control, no reactive movements, no defensive adjustments. The system remains unchanged regardless of external input. This creates stability that cannot be challenged directly, because challenge requires response, and response does not occur. Over time, this forces external systems into a state of inefficiency. They continue to apply pressure. They continue to attempt engagement. But each attempt produces no result. This leads to escalation, more force, more effort, more complex strategies. But all of it remains ineffective, because the underlying condition has not changed. There is still no access. Eventually, this creates exhaustion, not necessarily physical, structural. External systems begin to reorganize, not to defeat the system, but to adapt to its non-reactive nature. They reduce attempts at direct interaction. They shift focus to other targets. They reallocate energy away from a system that cannot be influenced. This is where dominance becomes complete, not because opposition has been eliminated, but because opposition has been redirected. The system no longer needs to manage resistance. Resistance moves elsewhere. This is the final advantage of non-reactive dominance. It does not suppress opposition. It displaces it. And once opposition is displaced, the system operates without interference. Not temporarily, continuously. At this level, power is no longer measured by what a system can do, but by what it no longer needs to respond to. Field redefinition. At lower levels, systems operate within a fixed field. The rules of interaction are assumed. Pathways are predefined. Signals are interpreted within shared structures. Every system accepts the boundaries of that field as given, and all movement, conflict, and control take place inside it. This creates a stable framework, but it also creates limitation. Because a system that operates entirely within a field is constrained by it. No matter how advanced it becomes, it must still follow the same underlying rules. It must engage where interaction is required, respond where pressure is applied, and adapt to conditions it does not control. This is the boundary of conventional power. Beyond non-engagement, this boundary shifts. The system no longer treats the field as fixed. It treats it as variable. This is field redefinition. Instead of operating within the given structure, the system begins to alter the conditions that define that structure. It does not directly modify every component of the field. That would require engagement. Instead, it adjusts the parameters that determine how the field behaves. These parameters are not always visible. They are embedded. Timing relationships, signal thresholds, pathway availability, energy distribution patterns. Small changes in these areas produce large changes in how the field operates. This is where influence becomes structural. The system does not act against other systems directly. It changes the environment in which those systems exist. As these changes accumulate, the field itself begins to behave differently. Pathways that once allowed interaction become less accessible. Signals that once triggered response lose coherence. Timing relationships shift, breaking synchronization between systems. From within the field, this appears as instability. Systems begin to experience difficulty interacting as they did before. Their actions produce less predictable outcomes. Their ability to apply force decreases. Their control mechanisms become less effective. But the field has not collapsed. It has been redefined. The system performing this redefinition remains unaffected. Because it is not operating within the same constraints, it is shaping them. This creates a new environment, one where interaction is no longer symmetrical, where access is uneven, where some systems continue to operate under outdated assumptions while others adapt to the new structure. This is where dominance becomes embedded in the field itself, not through visible control, but through altered conditions. At this level, the system does not need to maintain constant influence. Once the field has been redefined, behavior changes automatically. Systems respond to the new conditions without recognizing their source. They adapt their movement, adjust their strategies, and reorganize their structure to fit the altered environment. From their perspective, they are making independent decisions. In reality, they are responding to constraints that have been reshaped. This is the highest level of indirect control, because it does not require continuous action. It only requires correct positioning at the level where the field is defined. Once that position is established, influence becomes persistent, not through repeated intervention, through structural bias. At this stage, the system no longer needs to avoid resistance. The field itself no longer supports it in the same way. Resistance becomes fragmented, inconsistent, less capable of forming stable opposition. This is the final transformation. The system has moved from operating within the field to defining it. And once a system defines the field, it defines the limits of interaction for everything within it. Self-stabilizing superiority. At lower levels, superiority must be maintained. A system gains advantage, then works to preserve it. It monitors threats, reinforces its structure, and adjusts continuously to prevent loss of position. Superiority exists, but it is conditional. It depends on sustained effort, constant awareness, and the ability to respond to change. This creates fragility, because anything that must be maintained can be lost, and anything that depends on reaction remains vulnerable to what it cannot predict. Even highly advanced systems, when operating within this model, are never fully secure. Their superiority is always relative to current conditions. A shift in the field, an unexpected form of pressure, or a new competing structure can destabilize their position. This is the limitation of reactive superiority. It is never complete. Beyond non-engagement, this condition changes. The system no longer maintains superiority. It stabilizes it. This is self-stabilizing superiority. Instead of defending its position, the system exists in a configuration where loss of position becomes structurally unlikely. Not because it resists change, but because the conditions required to destabilize it no longer align. This is not achieved through reinforcement. It is achieved through removal of dependency. The system no longer depends on interaction to sustain its advantage. It does not require continuous feedback from opposing structures. It does not rely on monitoring or response cycles to maintain alignment. It operates independently of those processes. This independence changes the nature of stability. At lower levels, stability is active. It requires effort. It is maintained through constant adjustment. At this level, stability becomes passive, not in the sense of inactivity, but in the sense of not requiring correction. Because correction is only necessary when deviation occurs, and deviation requires exposure. Remove exposure, and deviation loses its pathway. This is the foundation of self-stabilization. The system positions itself so that external variation cannot meaningfully alter its structure. Changes in the field still occur. Other systems continue to move, adapt, and attempt to influence. But those changes no longer intersect with the system in a way that produces internal disruption. The system remains consistent, not because it resists change, but because change does not reach it. This creates a new form of advantage, one that does not need to be actively protected, because it is not being actively challenged. Over time, this advantage becomes normalized. The system no longer experiences fluctuations in control. It does not enter phases of instability followed by correction. It does not cycle between strength and vulnerability. It remains stable across conditions. This consistency compounds, because systems that operate under variable conditions must constantly adapt, while the self-stabilizing system does not. This creates divergence in performance over time. Small differences in stability become large differences in outcome. The system advances without interruption. Others advance with friction. The gap increases. This is where superiority becomes self-reinforcing, not through feedback loops in the traditional sense, but through absence of disruption. Every moment without interference allows the system to maintain alignment, while others expend energy adjusting to changing conditions. This creates asymmetry in effort. The system operates at constant efficiency. Others operate at variable efficiency. Over time, this difference becomes structural, because energy that is not spent on correction can be allocated to expansion, refinement, and positioning. The system develops further advantages without sacrificing its stability. This is multiplicative advantage, and it emerges without direct competition. At this stage, the system no longer needs to assert superiority. It is evident through consistency, through continuity, through the absence of failure. From the outside, this can be misinterpreted. The system appears inactive, unchallenged, unengaged. But this perception is incorrect. The system is not avoiding competition. It has moved beyond the conditions where competition operates. This is why attempts to challenge it fail. Not because they are weak, but because they are misaligned. They are applied within a field that the system no longer participates in. This makes direct competition ineffective, and indirect competition irrelevant. The system exists in a position where its superiority does not need to be proven, because it is not being tested within the same structure. This is the final shift before completion. Superiority is no longer something the system achieves. It is something it embodies, not through effort, through structure. The end of interaction. At lower levels, systems define themselves through interaction. They act, they respond, they adapt. Their identity is shaped by how they engage with the environment, how they handle resistance, how they process pressure. Every movement is part of a continuous exchange between the system and the field it occupies. This exchange creates structure, but it also creates dependency. Because a system that defines itself through interaction cannot exist without it. It requires signals, feedback, and response cycles to maintain coherence. Without those, it loses orientation. It becomes disconnected from the conditions that give it meaning. This is the final limitation of interaction-based systems. They cannot operate independently of the field. Beyond non-engagement, this limitation disappears. The system no longer defines itself through interaction. It defines itself through structure alone. This is the end of interaction. Not the absence of movement, not the absence of influence, but the absence of dependency on exchange. The system no longer requires feedback to validate its position. It does not need response to confirm alignment. It does not depend on resistance to shape its direction. Its structure contains all necessary information to operate. This creates a closed form of coherence, not closed in isolation, but closed in dependency. The system interacts when necessary, but it does not rely on interaction to function. This is what separates it from everything below. Because at this level, interaction becomes optional. And what is optional cannot control the system. This changes the role of the environment entirely. The field is no longer something the system must navigate carefully. It becomes something the system can observe without being affected by it. Changes still occur. Systems still move. Pressure still exists. But none of these require response. The system is no longer part of the cycle. It exists alongside it. This creates a new form of freedom. Not freedom of action, freedom from reaction. The system is not forced into behavior by external conditions. It does not need to adjust when the field changes. It does not need to protect itself from disruption. It does not need to correct its position. It simply continues, uninterrupted. This is the final state of non-engagement, where control is no longer expressed through influence over others, but through independence from them. Because independence removes vulnerability. And without vulnerability, there is nothing for resistance to act upon. At this point, power becomes absolute. Not in the sense of dominating everything, but in the sense of not being affected by anything. This is the highest form of stability. But it introduces a new problem. Because while the system no longer depends on interaction, it still exists within a field where other systems do. And those systems are still operating, still interacting, still shaping the environment. This creates a gap, not in capability, in perception. Because systems that operate within interaction interpret reality differently from systems that operate beyond it. They read signals, react to patterns, and define meaning through feedback. Their understanding of the field is based on participation. The system has left that framework, but it has not left the field. This is the next challenge. Not how to avoid interaction, but how to understand systems that are still bound by it. Because while the system is no longer affected by their behavior still affects the field, and the field still matters. This is where the next phase begins. Not power, not control, but perception. Because once interaction is no longer required, the limiting factor is no longer resistance. It is interpretation. Understanding how other systems see the field, how they detect patterns, how they respond to signals, how they construct meaning from incomplete information. This is the transition, from structural dominance to perceptual advantage. Because at the highest level, controlling the field is not enough. You must understand how the field is seen. This is where power evolves again, not through movement, but through awareness.